Big news of the hour, the US President Donald Trump has now once again taken a shot at the Asian leaders. Taking to Truth Social, Trump said that America has lost India, Russia to the deepest, darkest China. The post followed a picture of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, China's President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin together in the same frame. Andrew Latham is joining me on the telecast. Andrew, it looks like the war between America and the allies that have met at the SCO Summit has only become more serious, more lethal, where President Trump has now released a statement on Truth Social saying that India and Russia have been lost by America to the deep, dark Chinese territory. How do you react to this?
Well, there's really only one way to react. President Trump gets it wrong. India is not lost, and it certainly hasn't fallen unambiguously and decisively into the Chinese camp. That's not in India's national interest. I note that Prime Minister Modi did not show up for the big parade in Beijing, even though he was at the SCO Summit and there was lots of hugs and kisses and backslapping. That is India's grand strategy, multi-alignment, sometimes aligning with China on certain issues, sometimes with the US, often given the history with Russia. And the United States, President Trump, his administration need to get it into their head that India will never be unambiguously on Team America. It's always going to hedge its bets. It's always going to play the multi-alignment game. And the sooner the US, this administration, wraps its head around that, the better off everybody will be.
All right. Now, talking about economic sanctions that have been proposed by US President Donald Trump during that video conference that was being held at the Paris summit with the European leaders, Ukraine included, there was a mention, a proposal that Europe should sanction China for supporting the war in Ukraine. Do you feel that the tepid response that the Trump administration had with regards to dealing with China, particularly when it came to the tariff wars and trade deals, there's an additional 90-day reprieve, which is an exception that has been provided to China. Looks like the claws are out, and finally, Trump is taking China head on.
Well, I think in Trump's mind, he does see this as Cold War 2.0. And he kind of understands that the unipolar moment when the United States was the sole superpower and all that, that's past. And we're in this multipolar era, but he still tries to impose this Cold War framework on it. And he sees the U.S. as locked in this existential struggle with China for world hegemony or leadership or dominance, whatever you want to call it. And this is simply to overstate the fact. I don't think that accurately represents China's aspirations on the world stage. And I think there are some real downsides to adopting that posture on the part of the United States. Once you say Cold War, all of a sudden you're into containment. And once you say containment, you're into mobilizing great powers and middle powers and lesser powers in a gigantic alliance or coalition is a better technical term, against China. And the Europeans are falling into the trap, as it were. They're motivated more by the war in Ukraine and putting pressure on China there, but it all adds up to the same thing. A grand coalition of states, great powers and middle powers, arrayed and aligned against China, which is only going to impel China to do things which it might not otherwise do, because it can play the Cold War game as well. And I remind your viewers that the Cold War was a Cold War, but it almost became hot in 1962 over Cuba, 1984 over a NATO exercise, Able Archer, and the Berlin crisis as well earlier than that. It was a very near-run thing, and we don't want to run that risk again.
Right, absolutely. What do you anticipate is going to happen, particularly with regards to China-US trade wars? There was already an intention that had been expressed by the Trump administration in the past few months of levying tariffs to the tune of 240% on Chinese goods. And there was a reciprocal response that came from China as well. It looked like China was amongst the very few nations that stood up against the Trump tariffs, after which Trump had to de-escalate. He had to tone down his tariff war narrative against China. What's going to happen now?
I don't think the United States can afford a full-blown tariff war with China. It can't really afford one with India either. And I think the United States and the Trump administration might be learning that. I mean, the tone has shifted with respect to India in recent days. Not yet the policy, but the tone. Far less harsh on the part of the Trump administration and President Trump in particular. Look, the difference between where we are today and the Cold War with the Soviet Union is the only thing Americans bought from the Soviet Union was the occasional bottle of vodka. Beyond that, there was no economic interdependence. There was no economic interconnection. And that's not the case with China. These two economies are thoroughly integrated. And the costs to Donald Trump's electoral base, the MAGA crowd, would be enormous. I note, by the way, that if you read the fine print of the tariffs on India, pharmaceuticals and electronics are exempt from the 50% tariffs. Why? Because the MAGA constituency would face huge price increases in terms of their medications and in terms of their iPhones and things of that nature. And the same is going to be true of China as well. There'll be a lot of histrionics and a lot of theatrics about 250,000 million% tariffs. And then when it really matters, when it's in America's best interest, those tariffs won't be applied to particular sectors. So is it going to be an era of turbulence? Yes. Are the tectonic plates shifting in ways that will result in Cold War 2.0? I think not.
It's also interesting because while Trump has imposed these additional punitive 25% tariffs on India for purchasing oil from Russia and quote-unquote fueling the war in Ukraine, the European Union is very eager to sign that long-pending free trade agreement with India. There are indications yesterday Ursula von der Leyen and the EU Council President, both of them had a joint phone call with Prime Minister of India, and both were discussing how there is a need for increased push for signing that FTA by the end of 2025. We also see there is an announcement that has been made by the Chinese Foreign Ministry that the Portuguese Prime Minister is going to be visiting China very, very soon. So while Europe continues to move forward in having cordial trade relations, bilateral relations with India and China, notwithstanding the Ukraine war and the purchase of oil from both these countries from Russia, it looks like United States of America under Donald Trump has dug itself inside a hole. What do you think are going to be the implications of this?
Well, my first observation is that if one is looking for consistency in terms of foreign policy, especially European foreign policy, you're, to use an Americanism, barking up the wrong tree. Europe has, you would think that given Chancellor Merz's recent pronouncement that we really have to get tough with Russia over Ukraine, well, maybe stop buying Russian oil and gas, Europe. That might help. And then maybe if you're really going to be consistent, don't do a free trade deal with India that is purchasing Russian oil. I don't want to overstate the importance of that, but it's happening. If you would think that if there were a consistent European policy on this, A, they'd stop buying Russian oil, and B, they wouldn't enter into free trade agreements with countries that are purchasing Russian oil. And that's not the case. Europe is conflicted. On the one hand, it's making a great deal about the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, it has economic interests. It wants good trade relations with 1.4 billion Indians, obviously, with a very sophisticated high-tech sector that Europeans can benefit from. It wants good trade relations with China, obviously, 1.2 billion people, also sophisticated in certain subsectors of the economy. And it wants good trade relations with the United States. In a slightly different universe in which one's interests lined up with one's policies, this wouldn't be the case. But the Europeans are actively courting all three markets. And I'd be very surprised if they didn't do a deal with India, finalize that deal pretty soon.
Right. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me, sharing your views. It's also interesting because Donald Trump has remained quiet with regards to the European Union pushing for free trade agreement with India. Is he then going to decouple from European Union for dealing with the two countries, China and India, that have strong relations, bilateral and trade with Russia. Moving on, let's take a look at the other big development that has taken place. Veterans High politician Anuti